Hi, I'm Emily Utz, and today I will be talking about Chapter 9, Language, Thought, and Culture by Claire Cramsch from the Handbook of Applied Linguistics. So, to look ahead, this chapter discussed the relationship among language, thought, and culture, the linguistic relativity hypothesis, and what language, thought, and culture have to do with educational practices, which is something of particular interest to this course. We begin with Johann Herder and Wilhelm von Humboldt, whose initial ideas regarding language, thought, and culture kicked off further studies of their relationship within the field of applied linguistics. Johann Herder had the idea that language reflects thought, which is represented by his equation one language equals one folk equals one nation. Wilhelm von Humboldt believed that there is a link between language and culture and stated, "There resides in every language a characteristic worldview." This brings us to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which Cramsch believes to be the best formulation of the relationship among language, thought, and culture. Whorf coined the term linguistic relativity to represent this hypothesis, which states that we are at the mercy of the language we use, and our language shapes the way we think about and see the world. Linguistic determinism is a strong version of linguistic relativity and has largely been disregarded by linguists. Today, a weak form of linguistic relativity is considered acceptable and more appropriate for linguistics. In order to more comprehensively explain this relationship among language, thought, and culture, we now look at Lucy's 3 levels at which language can influence thought. So the first level is the semiotic and cognitive level, which is the way any symbolic system transforms thinking in certain ways. The second level is the linguistic or structural level, which is the way particular languages influence thinking about reality in particular ways, based primarily on their unique morphosyntactic configurations of meaning. And the third level, the discursive or functional level, is the way in which using language in a particular manner influences thinking. And we will explore these levels more thoroughly in the upcoming slides. Before we move to the first level, the semiotic level, here's a quick crash course for those who may be unfamiliar with this topic. Semiotics is the study of signs, symbols, and their use, and a sign is anything that communicates meaning, such as a phoneme, an utterance, a symptom of an illness, etc. If you look at the example of, just imagine looking at somebody's lawn. If it is green, then you immediately imagine, that the lawn doesn't need to be watered today. It's healthy, it's lush, it's growing. If it is brown, then the grass is unhealthy and that it's dying and it probably needs a little bit of water. So in this particular situation, the color of the grass is a sign. Now we will look at semiotic relativity, or how the use of a symbolic system affects thought. In order to explain this more clearly, Cramsch uses the example of metaphors. Metaphors bring together two things that typically don't go together in order to make you see one of those things in terms of the other. This is basically the use of language to represent how we visualize something. For example, English speakers often visualize the mind as a container. This can be seen as an expression such as, "You must be out of your mind," or "It slipped my mind." These phrases tell us that English speakers see the mind as something that can be filled and, things can be taken out of it or put into it at will. Now, linguistic relativity, or how speakers of different languages think differently when speaking, can best be understood through Dan Slobin's research. He essentially states that we can't prove that language determines our worldview, but we do have to follow the given language rules in order to describe that worldview. Slobin had worked with children of different language backgrounds in order to explain this idea. He asked all of the children to give a verbal account of the story that was shown in a series of pictures. Ultimately, Slobin identified that the verbs were expressed differently in each language used. For example, the English-speaking children would say, "The wasps were chasing him," while the Spanish-speaking children would say, "The dog was being chased by the wasps." Obviously, the children were looking at the same image, but the structure of their language and its rules may have made them focus on different aspects of the picture. Like, the English-speaking children would have focused more on the wasp's attack, while the Spanish-speaking children may have focused more on the dog running away. While we can't prove it, the language still has rules, and we have to use the language according to those rules to describe what we're seeing. Discursive relativity can otherwise be phrased as how speakers of different discourses, whether across languages or in the same language, have different cultural worldviews. These different discourses can be marked by contextualization cues, which are parts of speech that link what is said to what is thought to how the world is perceived. Discourse relativity also helps us understand that language is linked to a person's position in time, space, their social and historical relations, and their social and emotional identity. Cramsch gives the scenario of an African American graduate student who was sent to interview an African American housewife in a low-income inner-city area. When he arrives at the house, he is greeted by the husband instead of the wife, and the husband is also African American, and he smiles and says, in African American vernacular English, AVE, "So, you're going to check out my old lady, huh?" And the student responds more formally with, "No, I only came to get some information. They called from the office." The husband stopped smiling, didn't verbally respond to the student, and just left to go get his wife from the other room. Later on, the student recognized that he misread the situation and did not correctly interpret the contextualization cues. So, the biggest question next is, how does linguistic relativity affect educational practices? Well, in the 1990s, there was a cultural turn in applied linguistics, which brought the relationship of language, thought, and culture to the attention of linguistics in that field. Because language teaching and language acquisition is such a large part of applied linguistics, it was only natural that these ideas about the relationship of language, thought, and culture then spread to instructional methodologies and education. Linguistic relativity refocused the teacher from what they do, just teaching language, to who they are as people. Basically, it made teachers also remember what it was like to learn and acquire language. More importantly, though, it allowed instructors to link language, thought, and culture in their teaching methodologies and lesson plans. We can see that link and that relationship in many of the more modern approaches we read about in Module 1. The main point is that language relativity allows us to understand how speakers of other languages think and what they value, which later helps us to become both better teachers and better learners. So the two questions, or rather prompts, I leave you with are: 1, give an example of another metaphor and explain when and how it is used. Remember that metaphors are not similes. And 2, provide examples of contextualization cues and a situation in which they would be important. So think back to the example of the graduate student and his misidentification or misinterpretation of contextualization cues, and apply that and think of new cues and maybe even create a new scenario in which those cues would be used. Thank you so much for watching.